Bethlehem College and Seminary is still accepting applications for the coming academic year. For more information, visit bcsmn.edu.
If you'd like to turn in your Bibles to Proverbs 31, I'm going to start by reading starting in verse 10. Proverbs 31, verses 10 through 31. A wife of noble character who can find? She is worth far more than rubies. Her husband has full confidence in her and lacks nothing of value. She brings him good, not harm, all the days of her life. She selects wool and flax and works with eager hands. She is like the merchant ships bringing her food from afar. She gets up while it is still night. She provides food for her family and portions for her female servants. She considers a field and buys it. Out of her earnings, she plants a vineyard. She sets about her work vigorously. Her arms are strong for her tasks. She sees that her trading is profitable and her lamp does not go out at night. In her hand, she holds the distaff and grasps the spindle with her fingers. She opens her arms to the poor and extends her hands to the needy. When it snows, she has no fear for her household, for all of them are clothed in scarlet. She makes coverings for her bed. She is clothed in fine linen and purple. Her husband is respected at the city gate, where he takes his seat among the elders of the land. She makes linen garments and sells them, and supplies merchants with sashes. She's clothed with strength and dignity. She can laugh at the days to come. She speaks with wisdom, and faithful instruction is on her tongue. She watches over the affairs of her household and does not eat the bread of idleness. Her children arise and call her blessed, her husband also, and he praises her, saying, "Many women do noble things, but you surpass them all." Charm is deceptive, and beauty is fleeting, but a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. Honor her for all that her hands have done, and let her works bring her praise at the city gate. Abigail gave us a beautiful picture of what womanhood was designed to be, and Tilly told us the sad truth that it's broken and that it's subject to particular temptations. But my goal today is to capture your imagination. Proverbs 31 captures our imagination by describing a woman who literally throws her entire being into making a home for her family. Today, I want to inspire you with the story of another woman. When this woman's world was crumbling around her politically, theologically, and socially, she rolled up her sleeves and she got to work. And from the ashes of medieval society, she helped her husband to build a flourishing and God-honoring culture both at home and in the church. So here's the story of Katie Luther. Katie was born in Germany in 1499, and she was another girl, probably to the chagrin of her father. She was given the name Katharina von Bora. She was born into a world of conflict, a world that was tumultuously changing. During her lifetime, Gutenberg's printing press began churning out inflammatory pamphlets. King Henry VIII pulled England out of the Catholic Church. The plague swept through Europe in repeated waves. Germany was torn apart by the Peasants' Rebellion and other revolts. Hundreds of people were violently murdered, sometimes burned at the stake for their faith, and the Catholic Church was starting to lose its almost 1,000-year hold on Europe. When little Katie was just 5 years old, her mother died, and her father promptly dropped her off at the local cloister, the Benedictine cloister in Brenna. The Benedictines at that time offered education to both boys and girls because they were hoping to train them for monastic service, so this was an opportunity for her to receive schooling, but it would have felt frightening for such a little girl. I have a 5-year-old daughter, and I can't imagine taking her and dropping her off to be raised by strangers. Katie would have felt abandoned by her father, and she never again returned to her natural family. When she was 9 years old, she was moved to a more permanent home, the Cloister in Nimschen. Nimshin held a sweet connection to her dead mother because her aunt, Magdalena, her mother's sister, was already enrolled as a nun there. This was a sweet relief to Katie, and she lived in this convent for 15 more years. But Katie would have wrestled with grief over her mother's death, fear and pain from the abandonment of her father. She would have felt alone, and she may have wondered if God cared for her at all. But God was at work in Katie's life, just like he was at work in Joseph's life in Egypt, for her good and for his glory. Serving as a nun brought Katie training, education, provision, an ordered life, and relative security for an unmarried woman in the 1500s, but it did not bring with it peace with God. Instead, it brought cold sterility, separation from her natural family, and dark fears. In the convent, Katie learned to care for the sick and the poor, and she gained useful training in baking, gardening, medicine, and animal husbandry. She quickly befriended 2 other girls, and they began to whisper to her about writings that their uncle was smuggling into the convent. The writings were by an ex-monk named Martin Luther. As Katie read Martin's writings, she was confronted with a God who was much, much different from the God that the Roman Catholic theology was giving her. Katie had been taught that God was a remote and unfeeling judge, an angry one who was unapproachable except through acts of penance or the merits of the saints, and someone to be only feared. But now she read that God was a good and kind Father who loved her and who could be loved in return, and who offered her forgiveness because of the death of his Son. He was a God who loved her, and this love was a gift. It was not something that she had to painfully earn, and this loving Father would never abandon her. What powerful truth for women who had been cut off from their families. Understandably, the gospel spread through the convent faster than the plague. Soon 12 nuns were converted, including Katie and her 2 friends. After conversion, the women talked and agreed that they no longer wanted to live in the convent. In the 1500s, abandonment to the convent life was a socially acceptable solution to the problem of too many children, especially too many daughters. Most of the girls in the convent did not have a choice in being nuns, and they had not voluntarily taken orders. Now that they knew that their sterile monastic life would not merit them eternal life, they wanted out. So Katie took matters into her own hands. Somehow, she managed to smuggle a letter to Dr. Martin Luther himself, begging for his help. Now, Luther had already been helping monks escape from their monastic life, but helping nuns escape was another matter. One biographer that I read said that helping a nun escape from a convent would be similar to us helping a friend escape from federal prison. It was not only illegal, it was very dangerous. It could be fatal if you were caught. But Luther already had a price on his head, and so that wasn't anything unusual for him, and he could identify with the nuns, so he agreed to help them. Late on Saturday evening, Easter Eve, April 1523, Luther sent a fishmonger, or a fish seller, driving his wagon to wait right outside the walls of the convent at Nimshin. This fishmonger regularly delivered food to the convent, so he wouldn't seem suspicious. Somehow, in the middle of the night, all 12 nuns snuck out of their convent, fled across the grounds, and met their driver. He stowed them in his cart. Some legends say he actually hid them in the fish barrels and drove them all to Wittenberg. Once again, Katie would have felt alone and afraid. She had once again left the only home that she had ever known. Sorry, I knew I was going to do that. And she would have to trust God and complete strangers to care for her. Once again, God was at work for Katie's good, preparing her for the good works that he had designed for her to do. Now, Martin Luther had 12 ex-nuns to deal with. What on earth was he going to do with them? Most of the girls' families flatly refused to take them back. So Luther became dean of women and local matchmaker, trying to find husbands for all 12 girls. Within 2 years, every single one of them was married, except Katie. Now, Protestant marriage during this time was quickly changing, views of Protestant marriage. For most of the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church had viewed celibacy as much more holy than marriage, and sexuality, even sexuality in marriage, as dirty. If someone had to marry, then intimacy between husband and wife was discouraged. It was supposed to happen very infrequently or not at all. Pleasure in the act was always sinful, and it was only for the purpose of conceiving children. There were many, many, many laws about which days were off limits completely for sexual intercourse, and some even considered sexuality to be the original sin. There are even medieval stories of female saints who convinced their husbands to preserve their innocence by never consummating their marriage, and that's why they were a saint. However, the Reformers were searching the scriptures, and they were returning to a biblical definition of marriage and sexuality. They were beginning to see that from the beginning of creation, God said that it was not good for a man to be alone, that he needed a helper, and that his wife was designed to be that helper. They were again understanding that the family was the basic building block of society, designed and blessed by God, and they were beginning to see marital intimacy as a good thing. So, the Reformers decided to obey Scripture, and they started marrying each other. Many, many times it was ex-monks and ex-nuns uniting, and they quickly began to have babies. And now they had to figure out what on earth family life was supposed to look like. Katie was dropped into the middle of all of this new cultural rebuilding. She stayed first with the Reichenbach family and then with the Cranach family. The Cranachs were the artists of the Reformation, and the portraits that we have today of Luther and Katie were painted by Cranach. For 2 years, Katie served alongside these Reformation women. She served and she learned what biblical womanhood in Reformation Germany could look like. At that time, Katie might have been tempted to consider these early years as a waste, but they were providing an invaluable apprenticeship. They were providing an invaluable apprenticeship in family life for this young woman who had been only raised in monastic life. She had been raised surrounded by quiet nuns, not noisy children and unpredictable guests. So she had a lot she needed to learn. Katie was witty, intelligent, and pleasantly attractive. She immediately fell in love with a man named Hieronymus Baumgartner, who returned her affection, and everyone expected them to be quickly married. But he left Wittenberg and moved to another town, and she didn't hear from him for a year. And after the year, she found out that his family was strongly against him marrying an ex-nun. So once again, she would have felt the sting of abandonment, and she would have had to trust her future to God. Dr. Luther kept recommending other suitors for Katie. Katie turned every single one of them down. Finally, Luther's friend von Amsdorf told Katie that Luther was recommending a man named Caspar Glatz, who was old, and many people considered a skinflint because he was so greedy. Katie replied in exasperation that she would marry only von Amsdorf, the man that she was talking to, or Dr. Martin Luther himself. Luther laughed when he heard that. He was fairly certain that his celibate life would end in martyrdom, not in marriage. But when he laughingly told his parents the story, they didn't laugh back. Old Hans Luther, Luther's father, had wanted his son to be a lawyer, never a monk. And he told his son, "Go marry that girl and give us grandbabies." Luther considered, and he finally decided that his marriage to Katie could please his father, rile the Pope, cause the angels to laugh and the devils to weep. We assume that maybe it pleased Katie too. So Katie and Martin were married on June 13th, 1525. She was 26 and he was 41. Martin honestly admitted that he was marrying Katie to obey God and to be an example to the church, not because he loved her. But Katie quickly swept him off his feet. Now, this is horrifying, and I almost didn't include it, but I'm going to include it. The tradition in Germany at that time was to have a very small civil ceremony, followed by the immediate consummation of their marriage, witnessed by a close friend. Katie obediently followed the traditional marriage rites, and then got up the next morning and prepared a breakfast banquet for all their friends, followed by a much larger celebration and feast that she hosted 2 weeks later. The Elector of Saxony gave them as a wedding present the Black Cloister, the home where Martin had already been living. The Black Cloister was a former dormitory for 40 Augustinian friars, and Luther had already been living there for 18 years. When the Reformation swept through Wittenberg, all the friars left the cloister, and the cloister became a gathering place for hungry ex-monks who were wondering what they should do next. So now Katie, the former nun, was left with the monks' old quarters, which were literally black with mold. Have you ever visited a college boys' dormitory? Katie flew into action, armed with scrubbing brushes. She changed the hay in Luther's bed, which hadn't been changed in 2 years, furiously whitewashed the walls, and whipped the Black Cloister into shape. She drew on all of her training from the Nimschen Convent, and she learned to organize this new community. It quickly became a hub for Reformation thought and conversation and teaching. Katie managed cloister land. She hid their wedding presents from Luther because he was too generous. She eventually convinced Luther to allow her to buy more farmland so she could grow enough food for their growing household. She bred and sold cattle. She ran their home brewery, and she threw herself into the challenges that came with being Martin Luther's helper. Katie learned to be a welcoming and industrious hostess. She served her home-brewed beer and her home-baked bread. She joined in Luther's table talks with his students. She welcomed strangers who longed to hear more about the gospel, and she cared for friends and neighbors who were sick and dying from the plague. Do you remember COVID? Do you remember all the decisions that we had to make during the first few months of it? Mask or not, meet or not, shut down or not. Do you remember how gathering for Thanksgiving felt like possible civil disobedience? Do you remember how much controversy one little germ brought into the church? The plague in medieval Europe was like COVID, only worse, and without any social media. In fact, our term quarantine comes from the medieval term that they used to keep sailors on board a ship for 40 days to make sure that they weren't carrying the plague. The plague was so deadly that you could go to sleep perfectly well and be dead by morning. People would abandon their family members at the first sign of plague. And the plague swept right through Wittenberg, where the Luthers were living. So they had to decide what to do. Martin Luther refused to leave their home, and he refused to close their doors. So Katie took in many, many sick friends. She nursed them to health, or she held them while they died, and then she mothered their orphan children. There is no record of any Luther family member contracting the plague, although Luther was often very, very ill from other things. God protected their family as they cared for the sick and dying church members. In the middle of all this, Katie gave birth to 6 children, miscarried once, and buried 2 daughters. She also adopted at least 4 orphans, which I think is particularly poignant since she herself had been orphaned. And she welcomed many other children into her home. At least 17 children lived in the Luther household at one point. And do you remember her aunt Magdalena from the Nimschen Convent? She moved in with the Luthers and helped Katie to raise their large family. Katie named her second daughter Magdalena to honor her aunt. But Katie Luther also became a mother of the Reformation as she opened her doors and made a home for dozens of reforming monks. The Reformation that was birthed, fed, taught, nurtured, and cared for around Luther's table spread far and wide throughout all of Europe. Most of those reformers were not Katie's own biological children, but God was spreading her influence through this spiritual offspring. Tilly talked a lot about fear and how it can be hard for us to submit to our husbands because of fear. And I think this is something Katie would have had to face. It would have been a fearful thing to be married to Martin Luther. Martin Luther was not an easy man to fit, but Katie capably handled marriage to the busy and distracted leader of the German Reformation. Luther had powerful enemies who wanted him dead. He was convinced that his life was going to end in martyrdom. Many powerful men would have celebrated his death. There are stories of Katie begging him to please not travel to certain cities because she knew that it would end in his death. Luther was also frequently and unpleasantly sick. He had chronic stomach trouble. Katie managed Martin's physical struggles with cheerfulness, and she learned to be a competent nurse. Her son later became a trained doctor, and he said, "My mother is at least half of one." But Luther didn't just struggle with physical illness. He struggled emotionally as well. He periodically lapsed into dark depression and emotional despair. Today, we might say that he suffered from mental illness, but Luther was convinced, probably rightly, that he was under special attack from the devil. Katie lived closely and intimately with this man. She would have ridden Luther's emotional waves of despair and depression, and she would have prayed for God to deliver him. During one of Luther's particularly bad attacks of depression, when nothing else would work, Katie finally dressed herself head to toe in mourning clothes, black from head to toe. After a while, Luther finally noticed, and he asked her who died. Katie snapped, "God did. Since you're acting like God is dead, I wanted to join you in your mourning." Her plan worked. It made Luther laugh, and his depression lifted. In addition to his bold defiance of human and spiritual enemies, Luther could also be caustic, brash, and even occasionally off color in his jokes. Katie lived with his failures and weaknesses. She was probably occasionally the brunt of his gruffness and his brash tongue. And yet, despite his failings and her fears, she submitted to, fit, and followed this broken man because she trusted their faithful God. Being Mrs. Luther was not an easy calling, but Luther adored her. He called her Kitty, my rib, and my Lord Kate. She respectfully called him Doctor, and he responded by calling her Mrs. Dr. Luther and the Lady of Zulsdorf, which was their farm. They had a pleasant and affectionate marriage full of good-natured teasing. Luther once quipped, "If I can endure conflict with the devil, sin, and a bad conscience, then I can put up with the irritations of Katie von Bora." How did Katie do all this? How did she so capably manage the Black Cloister, serve so effectively, mother all those children, encourage the spread of the Reformation, and help her husband so well? When we look back at her early life, we can see how God used the entire first half of her life to prepare her to step into this role of immense responsibility. Through her struggles as a little girl with early abandonment, she had to learn to trust her good father. Through her time at the convent, she learned to read, to bake, to farm, to brew beer, to care for the sick, and to show hospitality to strangers. And through reading Luther's early writings, she learned the good news of the gospel, that Christ died for her sins, and that she could trust in him alone for her salvation. And through her time living with the Cranachs and the Reichenbachs, she learned what a godly marriage and home could look like. We don't have very many of Katie's words written down, but we can observe her life and see her vibrant faith. She dearly loved this God who had brought her the good news and had rescued her from the cloister. She saw herself as called by God to spread the Reformation by supporting her husband and carrying on the work and hospitality of the Black Cloister. She trusted God through constant threats and the death of friends and 2 children, and then she trusted God when he took her husband. Luther finally died of illness, not of martyrdom, in 1546. Many considered it a miracle that he had not been martyred. Their marriage lasted almost 21 years. In death, Luther once again challenged the German tradition by leaving all of his property to Katie rather than to their sons, because he dearly loved his wife and he was hoping to provide for her in her widowhood. But after Luther's death, 2 brief wars swept through, and they almost completely destroyed her farm and the Black Cloister. And so she lived in semi-poverty until her death at age 53. As she lay dying, she said, "I will stick to Christ like a burr to cloth." Do you see why Katie Luther captures our imagination? Like Katie, we are facing the ruins of religious civilization in the West. We too are facing disease, death, political unrest and rioting, church conflict, persecution, and the prospect of even more uncertainty. At this point, no popes want to kill our husbands, but we still have time for that. As we face the ruins of our civilization, we can look back into church history, and we can learn from and be inspired by other women. Katie Luther left the coldness and sterility of monastic life, and she threw herself into service and life as a joyful helper suitable to her husband. And God used each of the hard and painful twists in Katie's life to prepare her for this good work. It would be fair to say that without Katie, the Reformation would not have been as successful as it was. May God use us, like Katie, in our own spheres of work and ministry to help spread the joy of a Godward life.
This presentation was made possible by the generous contributors to the Serious Joy Scholarship, permitting our graduates to launch into life and ministry without a burden of student loan debt.